Hi, welcome to the intermediate part, which is the second part of mastering version control with Git. We already went through the introduction part, the first part of the course, and now it's the intermediate part, which we are creating this tutorial video for. My name is Farhad Eftekari, and I'm the lecturer of this course. First of all, I need to declare that most of the content of this course has been created from Atlassian Git content, which is a very beneficial and nice content on the internet, and also combine it with my own personal experiences to make it like some sort of a practical material for the students to use. And before you start with the material of the course, you need to make sure that you registered and you got accepted for this course to use the material and the videos and everything of the course. Here's the link, which I assume that you already been there. And here are some typographical conventions which we also got familiar in the first part, so we may encounter them at the bottom of the slides and make sure to understand them. Some sort of a hint to the material. And we also divided the material as usual into three different levels of difficulties. It depends on the student, how deep they want to gain their knowledge from. Some people would like to just get familiar with the concepts, and some would like to go deeper with the material and gain much more deeper knowledge with them. And here is the slide framework we are using. As usual in other courses, we have the title, difficulty level indicator are being shown here, the slides number, the content, and the course name and section name, and those typographical conventions that we got familiar with. Alright, so let's start with the content of this part of the course. Actually, we tried our best for the intermediate section and advanced section to provide all of the Git commands to make the students be familiar with them, go deeper with like different options of different commands. So what I'm really looking forward to obtain is to make the students familiar with all of the commands, and then at the end of the course we're gonna add one extra part, which gonna be the practical part, which we're gonna in practice actually use these commands to see like in real life, simulated real life like application or project. The purpose is first we get familiar what is like exists here for us to use, what is like for a team of developers or different kind of people as some sort of a tool for like this Git concept to use. But I'm not expect students to memorize anything or like be familiar with anything, because even like in most of the cases they are like limited amount of like commands, which in most of the cases is like practical and being used in like maybe 90% of the situations. But there are like different ones, like 10%, that in like very rare situations you may obtain. So I usually try to give the knowledge to my students to learn the material, to know what things are there for you to use, and then it's like the students' part and portion of like effort to go deeper and like find out more and like try to use them in like their own situations as well. So I don't like to get bored, to make bored my students with like all the different commands, different kind of small details of the options that exist for like commands. But it's nice to get familiar, it's nice to go through them, talk about them, be familiar with them. But in practice, like I said, we're gonna work with the most used ones and like medium types, and then it's then for the students part that like in practice gain deeper knowledge about them. So yeah, like I said, thanks to the feedback we received from the students, we're gonna add the fourth part, which is gonna be the practical part of the material and the different part of the course that later we're gonna add. Alright, now I'm excited to start this part of the course. So let's start with the definitions as usual. VCS stands for Version Control System, SCM stands for Source Code Management, RCS stands for Revision Control System, CIS stands for Continuous Integration, and IDS stands for Integrated Development Environment. We may encounter these abbreviations inside of the content of this part, so make sure to get familiar with them. All right, to set up a repository and get us started, there are these three nice git commands. We have git init, git clone, git config. So let's get familiar what do they really mean and what are the different options. So when we want to create a new git repository in a directory, actually we can use git init. It's very simple. It creates the minimum definitions of a git repository inside of the directory for us. And here are different actually kind of options that we can use. We can just go to a directory and then type git init, or it comes from initiate. So however you like to pronounce it, it's up to you. And the other option would be like we also mention the directory, in which directory we want to this repository, empty repository be created. And then we have the option of bear. So then you need to also remember, if it's a shared repository, then we need to also include this option of --bear. All right, now you may ask, so what's the difference between git init and git int --bear? So the big picture is like when we use git init, it's like for developing and for working actually. But when we use git --bear, it's for sharing your repository. It's the structure of your repository that's being created. As I also explained here, the folders, the subfolders, the history of your repository, how it's being shared, how the files are being structured. It's the way actually it defines. So in most of the cases, git init would be fine, especially for your own projects. And then we have the command git clone. In many cases, actually, especially when you work in a team, you join in a developer team, there's already a Git repository that everybody are using. So there's this link that they have that you can use by using the command git clone, that you are cloning or getting a copy of an existing Git repository, and then you have your own version on your local computer. So that's how you actually copy a repository from a source to your local computer. And here is also different options. You can either use git clone and then the link of the repository, or mention the directory of which directory is been like created. If you use this command, it's gonna create the repository inside of the directory that you're actually applying the command. And here is also explanation of some fundamental concepts related to collaboration of like repositories to repositories between Git concept and SVN concept. Well, nothing very important that I go deeper in it, but if you like, you can also gain a bit more knowledge from it. Sometimes it's a bit like maybe harder for people to catch up with some contents if they are already familiar with SVN, but also, of course, it gives some other advantages, like already familiar with some other concepts. But we try our best to also actually include some differences with like this kind of fundamental issues or like concepts related to that, but nothing very major for a developer to work with. So here you can see in like SVN concept, we have this central repository, and then for working copies there are like these relations, but in Git actually repositories are some sort of a collaboration that they have with each other. And actually you can also apply some configuration for your repository. So you can use git config command. Here is also are also some actually options that you can use. So you can define your username. So So the whole thing of like Git, when you're applying the commits and then you're like applying the changes to the repository, is like to know also who did that and like who pushed these like changes to the repository. So these definitions and these kind of configurations is also very important, because later then everyone in the project can see like who did the changes. So this is the way actually you define your username. In most of the cases, by default, it's been created, especially if you're like actually using your own credentials, whether it's like GitHub or different kind of like systems that you're using. But it's nice to know that actually with these comments, you can actually define those configurations as well. So what actually Git stores this configuration is this inside these 3 separate files, which then later when you actually define the configurations, you can actually open and see the content of it. And it's like the same by like applying or like editing and modifying these files instead of actually running those commands. So that's the same thing. And here is the example of one git config file. And as I said, you can manually edit them, and it has the same effect as using the git config. So one thing that I also like to mention is, well, it's really up to the people how they like to use these git commands. Some people really like to only use the keyboard and just run the commands. Some people would like more graphical user interface. There are like many other applications actually in the step 4 or part 4 of the course. I'm gonna actually also get you familiar with source tree, which is a graphical user interface for using Git. So it's up to you how you like to use it, as long as you do the job and pushing the commands and like commits and like applying the changes to the files, and everybody else are like using your work. So it doesn't really matter how you like to use it. It's up to your preference actually. The next category of the commands would be how we can save changes. We have git add, git commit, and git stash. Now let's get familiar with the commands that actually we can use to save changes. Alright, now when we modify some files, when we do some changes, we can actually store those changes in the working directory by using git add. So it's a way that we also delivering to Git how we can actually include these updates to those particular files, and then for the next commit actually we somehow and then later push them to the repository. So it's really important to know when you're applying git add, at first when you hear the name, you may think that you're adding some sort of a file to your repository, but it's not. You're actually adding some history of changes to the repository. So you already created those files and like modified them in a way, and then by git add you're actually, as I said, you're somehow adding them to the staging area. And here are also different options that we can actually use git add command. It's really interesting that by using git add dot, we are actually adding all of those files that has been changed. Yeah, and one thing that actually is also is a fundamental change is like the difference between git add and svn add is like we are not adding any files, unlike svn. All right, now another very practical Git comment is Git commit. So once we added those changes to the staging area, then by using Git commit, we are actually committing these commits and changes to the project history. Here are also some options that we have. So let's get familiar with them. When we apply git commit, actually it asks you for the message. So you can already define the message and then give them some kind of a message to that. So remember, actually when later you see your repository in your GitHub or wherever, this message will be in front of those files that has been changed as some sort of a hint that, okay, what has been changed, what is like the reason of these comments, these commits for those files that like got changed. Then also we need to also include -a to actually these comment commit a snapshot of all those changes to that working directory. So also here I'd like to explain that when you're actually committing those changes to your repository, they are being applied to your local repository. You are not changing anything on the server repository or like the main repository that everybody are using. So that's the beauty of it. So these changes are being done to your local repository, and then later we will get familiar how we can actually send or push those changes to those actually remote repository. Here I also provided the content to see what is the fundamental changes of between Git and SVN for snapshots and differences. So this mainly speaks about how actually SVN and Git are like treating the snapshots and differences for restoring the files and changes. There are tons of actually material online to somehow analyze and like discuss these differences of like fundamental differences of like how Git and SVN store these changes, differences, and snapshots. It's a very nice actually self-learning topic if you are more interested like with this like fundamental part. So for most of the developers or like people who like to work with Git is like doesn't really matter like how it's like being stored different kind of like a snapshots or differences, although it's always nice to know like the different architectural like ways of like applying some features or like some concepts, but I'm not gonna go very deep with these concepts with you. Alright, now let's get familiar with Git stash. It's actually a very nice and practical command to use. So what it does is temporarily somehow hide away the changes you already made with your like some of the files, some of the part of the files. So you want to get back to working in some other parts, but you don't want these changes to be applied for that. You want to have some sort of an older version of those files to work with. So you don't need to be worried about like creating different kind of branches or like create another or clone another like repository. So by using Git stash, you somehow are depriving those changes for the repository of your local repository, and you're just doing your thing, just like older time. And then you can also get back to what you've been created before. So that's also a very nice and handy comment. It's a bit more professional compared to like the ones that we already got familiar with, but in some cases you may need that. So it's nice that there is this feature for you to use, that in some cases if you want to get back to some editions of the files that you already modified, so you can actually do that with Git stash. as a temporary thing, like I said. And here you can see, which we're later gonna be familiar with git status, but we need to actually run that. Then you see what has been changed here. So now you see here when we run git status, you see like on this branch, actually a new file has been added and this file has been modified. So when we run git stash, it shows you some message, and then when you run git status again, it shows you something that, okay, there's nothing to commit and everything is like, well, nothing has been changed. So that's the difference that this git stash actually is creating. All right, and now the interesting question we actually ask from ourselves could be how we can reapply those stash changes. So there are two ways actually. Now you can see we run this git status command. There's nothing to commit. But once we run git stash pop, actually all of those changes with the new files and modification of the files are actually being applied and then being removed from the stash. But then there's also another command which we have git stash apply. So it applies these changes to your working copy, but it also keep them in your stash for later use or whatever. And actually you can also stash multiple changes or multiple stashes actually. And then you see you can also use git stash list, which also gives you the list of stashed files and different kind of like stashed. And then also you can maybe pop them out or apply them, and then for instance in this case this one is being applied and then it's being removed. So that's also the way to deal with multiple stashes. Not very often you encounter that, but it's very nice that this feature actually gives you flexibility to work with these kind of situations. And then also there's a very interesting command which you can use in order to actually create a branch from your stash. So here you can see git stash branch, and then there's this name of the branch that you give, and then out of which branch, which stash. And if you only have one, then doesn't really matter to actually provide this one. And actually, if you decide you no longer need a particular stash, then you can apply this command, which is git stash drop stash which stash, and then applies it for you. And if you apply this one, then all of these stashed ones will be removed for you. All right, now let's see how we can inspect a repository. There are two very nice and very practical git commands. We have git status and git log. So we have very nice command to use, which is git status. It actually gives you like some information about like the state of the working directory and the staging area. It gives you what file has been added as a new file, what has been like the changes of those files, what are the committeds, and this kind of information. But of course it doesn't give you any like information about the committed project history. That's the job of git log, which later we'll see. Here you can see the example of git status actually. And then we have git log, which is the history of the commits. That's the whole difference, which is like quite important. So interestingly, once you committed the changes to your repository, then when you apply git status, as we saw in the previous example, there's nothing to be shown. But then for getting that information, you can apply git log to see what is the actually log of those committed commits. Here are also different options which you can use. So it's some sort of a very interesting flexibility. You can actually look for a certain person commits actually for them to be only shown. It's nice for you to also get familiar with them. Some of them like are more useful, some of them like in very rare situations you can actually get a log of a certain file as well. Alright, now let's see how we can view the old commits. We have this comment which is git checkout. Now let's get familiar with git checkout command. There are three different functions that git checkout actually does for us. First, checking out files. The other one is checking out commits, and then the third one would be checking out branches. Let's get actually familiar with the first two here. So we can check out files and commits. So what does it mean? So when we check out commits, it means we are shifting our repository to a state that it used to be for that commit without changing the whole working directory. So that's a very, very practical feature that we can use. So if we go here, then you can see if we are currently at this state, when we check out this commit, we actually gonna get back to the phase and the state that it used to be here for that working directory. So then we can somehow see what has been before and then do whatever we want to do with that part. And now let's talk about checking out files. Actually, when we check out files, we are bringing back a previous edition of that file. So then in that way, we are somehow changing the current state of our repository. And here are different options that we can actually use. We can either use check out the name of the branch to check out a branch and go to that branch state. Or then, as I said, for that file, check out the commit, and then so it means we are not bringing back the whole commit, and if we have like multiple changes or new files, we are only bringing that history and edition of that file for that commit. That's it. And when we are like applying this checkout commit, we are actually getting back to that phase for the whole commit. And now here actually we can see in practice how it works. So actually when we write this command git checkout that commit ID, then we are getting back to this phase. So these two changes are not being, these three changes are not being applied. And now let's see how we can actually undo the changes. So we already got familiar with some of the features of git checkout. So then we have git revert, git reset, and git clean. They're actually very nice and practical features that we can use with these commands. In many cases, actually, we messed up something and the project is not working or not compiling. So in that way, there are many, many ways we can get back to a stable edition that it used to be. We already got familiar with git checkout. Let's see. with git revert now. So what git revert command does is to undo a committed snapshot. So if something goes wrong, the project is not working for some reason, by git revert and using the name of that commit, then we are getting back to the state that it used to be before applying that commit. Here actually you can see the actual comment. And then we have git reset. So the difference between git reset and revert is actually when we apply git reset, the commit will not be there for us to get back. So we somehow consider it as an unsafe or a bit dangerous method to do that. We can either reset a file by git reset the file name, or git reset like the whole staging area will be like matched with the recent commit. So if you make sure that the changes are not going to be actually used ever again, so we can actually use this -- hard as well to totally actually overwrite all the changes on the in the working directory. And actually we can also reset a certain commit by using git reset commit. And also same applies with this git reset -- hard and then the commit name. Very practical, but somehow needs to be very like cautious and like make sure that we're not going to use those commits because like we said, there's not going to be any getting back to the previous phase. Now let's get familiar with like the difference between git reset and git revert. Well, when we revert to a commit, we are not actually changing anything about the history. But when we are resetting, actually we are putting away those parts from the history. So then that's the reason that we are not actually gonna get back to those phases. But it's a very like some sort of advanced topic, and if you're a beginner to working with Git, make sure to always communicate with your team members, your project manager before applying, especially Git reset, because then you may like end up in a situation that you're like somehow ruining some part of the whole project that everybody else like participating to develop. So be very, very cautious about applying these comments. Now let's get familiar with git clean. It's a very, very beneficial and practical command like any other, well, actually git commands. So what it does is somehow it's removing untracked files from your working directory. There are some files which you may not need and it's not included in your working directory, so by applying git clean, actually you're getting rid of those files. And here we have actually two parameters that we can use. So what this one does, git clean -n, is only shows you what are the files that like are going to be removed. They are not really actually being removed, but it shows you that if you run git clean, then these files gonna be removed. So it's always recommended to run it first and then actually run git clean. And then -f also force those files to be removed. And then we can also apply path as a variable to make sure those files are being removed only inside of this path. And then we also have two different options. Okay, so as a comparison to the commands that we can use to undo changes, we have git reset for commit level, and then git reset for file level, git checkout for commit level, and actually checkout for file level, just like reset. And then also for revert, also same applies with commit level and file level. It's nice to totally understand in what scenarios which one gonna be used. But once you get familiar with them, then you see that how easy it is to use them. The name at first may sound very, very familiar, or like get mistaken by like the other purposes, but don't worry about them. You definitely can like understand the differences as if you already didn't do that. Here is also a link if you wanna do a bit more further study. But in any of these topics, there are like much more material and content to gain a deeper knowledge and understand like the difference between, especially with these similar concepts, especially like in Git, there are always scenarios that you can interchangeably use the other ones. So try your best if you are interested to get to know more knowledge, search online, find out more. But it was enough, in my opinion, to make yourself familiar with these very nice but very practical comments. And feel free to send us feedback if you have any ideas, if you have like topics that you like to learn. So be on top of the management of the content and everything. We always would like to hear feedbacks and apply them on the course material. So here it was the ending of the second part, which was the intermediate part of mastering version control with Git. Thank you for your consideration. I hope you had a nice time, and looking forward to see you on the third part, which is going to be the advanced part of the course.